But I just wanted to give a brief overview of some of the work that we do in the Red Nation and some of the work that we do both at a quote unquote national but also international scale, and why it's important to have organizations like the DSA as allies in this particular struggle. And so I just want to go over some of the I guess like there are lessons to be learned from Standing Rock, and I think a lot of you have familiarity with that particular struggle, but I think it's important to put it into both a national context in terms of the Indigenous movement, where it's at, where it's going, as well as an international context, and how we're seeing many of the same kind of policies that we were fighting in the Obama era, now under the Biden era. I think it's important to kind of see a continuity between Obama, Trump, and Biden versus saying Biden is a kind of departure from the Trump administration. So first of all, I just want to say that the water protector movement, as many of you know, isn't just an exclusively Indigenous movement. It's definitely led by Indigenous people. And it's not to say that the era of the water protector inaugurated water protectors as we know it today, or created them, or it's where it began. But nonetheless, there was something special that happened at Standing Rock. As Indigenous people, of course, we were water protectors prior to colonialism and have been since time immemorial. But there's something unique that happened at Standing Rock that is worthy of attention. And I think it's important to put into context the Obama presidency and its alliance with the fossil fuel industry specifically, that led to that particular struggle, and how we understood it as the Ocheti Shakoi and as Indigenous people, but also I think something that gets ignored as anti-imperialists. And so I'll begin with the third point, because that might not be a point that is really kind of shared publicly or mainstreamed in a way that we talk about it in our home communities. So first of all, the Obama administration, it was under the Obama administration where we saw the rapid increase in domestic oil production, 88% to be exact, from the time he came into office to the time he left. And most of that was directed towards fracking. And we can kind of see this playing out now with the drums of war being beaten to essentially intervene, to pre-invade Ukraine, to prevent an invasion, right? And this is over the Nord Stream pipeline. And we see Biden trying to push North American gas companies to kind of take the place of Russian gas with the Nord Stream pipeline. And I would say very much in a similar vein, the Obama administration saw America and energy independence, which was his policy, as a way to essentially wean the United States off of foreign oil imports. And it was under his administration that the United States became the first, for the first time in history since the 1970s, a net exporter of oil. And specifically, this coincided with the fracking revolution in 2008. And it was also a way that the Obama administration began to look at countries like Venezuela, and which has the world's largest oil reserves, and began to say, we don't actually like these these alternatives to neoliberalism. And it was actually under Obama where we began to see the kind of heaviest and most deleterious sanctions against Venezuela. It was Trump implemented 213 during his administration, none of which Biden has repealed, but it was actually Obama's sanctions against Venezuela that actually set into motion what Trump later did during his administration. But what's fascinating about this particular moment in time is that his sanctions specifically targeted Venezuela's oil capacity and oil production capacity, because up until that point, the United States and the oil companies that were invested in Venezuela refused to kind of do technology transfers to allow Venezuela to refine its own oil. And a lot of it had been imported and sent to places like the Gulf of Mexico, where it's refined in places like Houston. And so the Obama administration began to target what it saw as like competitors, nations, and specifically not just oil competitors, but people who challenged U.S. hegemony within the global South, and specifically targeting Venezuela and Hugo Chavez, right? And for us as Indigenous people, we were like, Chavez, I first heard about Chavez when he began his heating relief program for Northern Indian reservations. My reservation actually received heating assistance during a very cold winter. And that's where I first began to understand what the Bolivarian Revolution was. And so when, Standing Rock popped off, a lot of us were, talking about the creation of oil pipelines, domestic oil pipelines within a geopolitical frame. And I don't think that really translated. A lot of people just think of us as like mystical, like people, like the Na'vi. We like to plug our braids into trees. We do a lot of praying, that's kind of what gets the cameras, but I'm not going to do that today for you guys. I want to talk about the kind of anti-imperialist struggle and how we understand the geopolitics of oil production. So, Obama canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, or at least the northern leg. He didn't cancel the southern leg, which was considered a domestic pipeline. It may have been transporting Canadian extracted or Canadian mined tar sands, but nonetheless, it was a domestic route. So President Obama approved 3/4 of the Keystone XL pipeline. He didn't kill the pipeline. He just killed the northern route, which crossed an international border, which fell outside his domestic oil policy or domestic energy production policy. And the Dakota Access Pipeline actually fell within his domestic oil production policy. So it was something that he essentially approved. But as we saw it play out on the ground, there was this really great interview that kind of got, ignored. The Democracy Now! Did with Winona LaDuke as she was like walking to the front line. And she said, the reason why, the Dakota Access Pipeline is being built is because the U.S. has, essentially waged war on countries in the global South like Venezuela. And it might seem counterintuitive to think about sanctions against oil companies in the global South when we're talking about climate justice. But it's really how we understand, even as people who consider themselves water protectors and have led, one of the most historic fights against oil and gas in both Canada and the United States, we understand like development, we understand imperialism, and we understand especially that the way that global South nations develop is definitely curtailed by the policies of the global North. And it's also to understand that within the context of the Cochabamba Accords, which were passed or which were created in 2010 in Bolivia, that they actually made a similar argument, something that we had participated in, as Indigenous activists, climate activists in the North, and understanding that development, we understand like we have to move towards and transition towards sustainable development, but we also understand that the way that the levels of consumption in the global North, are unfair in how they impact the global South. And so a country like Bolivia, a country like Venezuela will never have the per capita carbon emissions or be responsible for the kind of the emissions levels per capita of countries like the United States and Canada, nor do they have the same level of climate debt. And in fact, they would be considered nations that the United States and Canada owe climate debt to, right, under the framework of the Cochabamba Accords. And so this is something that we really thought about in terms of drafting the Red Deal, which I think the DSA has passed as a working document in collaboration with something like the Green New Deal. So this is just a kind of a brief overview. I don't have a whole lot of time to get into a lot of the inner workings of that, but I think in this moment in time when we are talking about the transition away from fossil fuels, we have to remember the importance of water protectors and the role that they played. So Indigenous people in the United States make up around 1%, 1.5% of the total population. And I think it's around 3% in Canada. They're more visible, or what's considered a more visible minority in Canada than they are in the States. But given their kind of small, or given our small demographic size within both countries, Indigenous-led movements in Canada and the United States, according to an Indigenous Environmental Network report that was just issued last fall, Indigenous-led movements are challenging a quarter of the carbon emissions from both Canada and the US. And so when we think about who are sort of the vanguards of the climate justice movement, it's not teenagers from Sweden, right? White teenagers from Europe who are actually the vanguards of these struggles, or those who get the kind of stage at COP26. It's actually land-based movements, and you know, I think that's a really important kind of like factor that we have to consider. But also, we have to understand that in this moment in time, the reality of transition is it's a pragmatic concern by both capital and social movements. But I think in this moment in time, we've also ceded a lot of ground on the left, or lost a lot of ground on the left, over the question of extractive capitalism itself, because extractive capitalism isn't something that's unique to the fossil fuel industry. But as we've seen with, you know, Biden's own Build Back Better plan, or promises to transition away from the fossil fuel economy, and, you know, promises of electrifying the federal fleet, we know that those kind of resources that go into so-called green renewable technologies, which I think many of us would argue are essential in a transition to a post-fossil fuel economy, have to come from somewhere. And simply, the technology doesn't exist right now to not have like things like pure copper ore that has to be extracted from the earth itself. It can't be recycled. That goes into renewable technologies like electric cars. So you have to create new copper mines. You have to create new lithium mines. You have to find these resources to continue and to maintain the levels of consumption in places like the United States. And so you have to, you know, we might have heard of things like Line 3, and support, you know, movements like Line 3, or movements against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And we should support, you know, those struggles, and understand that, you know, the number of water protectors who were arrested at Line 3 actually far exceeds those who were arrested at the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. We have to ask ourselves, why is it that one got more attention than the other one didn't? The same kind of resistance, is still the same, but also we have to ask ourselves why we don't know of movements such as the movement at Thacker Pass. I don't know if anyone has heard of this, but it's slotted to be one of the largest open pit lithium mines in northern Nevada, which is being opposed by Shoshone and Paiute people, right? And so as we even as we move into kind of this green energy, you know, revolution or whatever, the kind of colonial extractive capitalism that defined the fossil fuel age is now defining the, you know, green revolution age. And there isn't a really, I think, a mature conversation about what that's going to look like for Indigenous people, because it was under Obama and the National Defense Reauthorization Act that we got Resolution Copper, which, you know, set aside an San Carlos Apache sacred site for Rio Tinto, which is an Australian mining company, to come in and create one of the world's largest copper mines, which will actually go about 2,000 to 3,000 feet below the surface, which will actually destroy the sacred landscape, and that's largely to meet America's projected energy needs that will be fed essentially by these green renewable technologies. And so that's really what, at the heart of what we're talking about when we talk about the Red Deal. It's like we want to transition, but we want to just transition. That means, that we move away not only from capitalism, but we also move away from the extractive colonial, relationships that this government and these corporations have towards Native people. And what we learned in in the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle, as well as within the Line 3 struggle, that this is something that, neither one of those struggles would have been possible nor successful to the degree that they were successful, even though they didn't stop the pipelines, had it not been for non-Indigenous allies. And so it's not just an Indigenous struggle, right? These are universal aspirations. Like, everyone drinks water, right? Anyone can become a water protector. It's just that these struggles are grounded in Indigenous values, as well as grounded in Indigenous leadership, and they're incredibly effective. And so I think in this era of global climate change, as well as an era where we are promoting alternatives, I think Indigenous people, whether you like it or not, are going to be at the forefront of this struggle. And it's how we work together in a way possible that is productive for understanding that this is a land that we're going to have to share. It's not exclusively like Indigenous issues; they're everyone's issues. And so, with that, I'll just open it up for questions because I'm out of time.
Mitch had a question.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, my speaker is way down. Thank you for that talk. So my question is, so the Red Deal calls for going further than the Green New Deal by taking explicitly international view of political economy. So how should the US left deal with electoral champions for the Green New Deal that may not be committed to international solidarity for emancipation and abolition? It's kind of a contradiction there, so I'll let you answer it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the first challenge is actually to build a movement to challenge the elected officials, and it's one of the principles of the Red Deal is to say that only movements can do what politicians can't do. And so our primary task in this moment as the Red Nation, but also folks that we work with, is to build a left alternative social movement, not just putting people in power.
Forrest.
Hi, Nick. Thanks a lot. I was just curious. I heard you mentioned Thacker's Pass, and I'd heard of that from another comrade who's been going there. I'm just wondering if you had any suggestions about ways that we could help support there. I know it's a little far away, but it's on our border, and yeah, if you had any suggestions.
Yeah, there's actually Okay, so there's the People of the Red Mountain, and that's kind of the coalition of Indigenous groups that are leading that. So you can find them. It's People of the Red Mountain. You can find them on Instagram, and they're considered the leaders of that particular struggle. So I'd recommend, if you want to support it, to check out their work.
Hi. My name's Kian. Thanks so much for coming. I'm curious, what role do you think the treaties play in transition confrontation questions?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's a kind of case that's been put forward by White Earth in the Line 3 struggle that's actually using treaty rights to say that the rights of Monoman, or the rights of wild rice, are possibilities in protecting water, right? To say that these sort of non-human entities have a right to exist unto themselves, and to take away their water rights, or to threaten or contaminate their water rights, is actually a violation of treaty rights, because for White Earth and many of the or several of the northern Anishinaabe nations in Minnesota, it's actually written into their treaties with the United States government that they have a right to access and harvest Monoman. And it's not just, again, it's not like a mystical relationship. It's like, when you talk about, when I was there, the wild rice harvesters, that's seasonal income for them. And people were talking about jobs. That the oil, the oil business would bring in. It brought in 5,000 temporary jobs, but it also threatened the livelihoods of wild rice harvesters who depend on that wild rice, and because of a drought, they weren't able to harvest as much as they could. And that was not even because of the pipeline. It was just because of regular, climate change. And so when people talk about this jobs narrative with the oil and gas industry, I know there's some people who are like, and we should like reach out to unions and have these conversations, because unions do cross picket lines when they go to work, and they cross an Indigenous blockade, because many of those people at line 3 were trying to protect the wild rice business that they participate in. They may not be a formal union, but they're throwing up a picket that unionized pipeline workers are crossing every single day. They're scabs essentially. And we do need to have that conversation with organized labor. It's a little bit, it's really difficult. I've tried to have it in the past. But I think framing it as a labor issue is also important, because it helps workers understand that this is you're affecting somebody else's livelihoods. It's also important to point out that the Daily Poster came out with this interesting study that showed that there are only 500,000 oil and gas workers in this country. So their numbers are actually incredibly inflated. Those are permanent oil and gas, long-term oil and gas workers, not the temporary workers that they kind of hire to build pipelines and stuff. So it's not a very big industry in terms of its employment.
We're out of time for this section. Does anybody object to having Jorg, Jad, Natasha, and Serena ask their questions all at once? And Nick, if that's okay with you, that many questions at once? Okay, does anybody object to having that many, to just finishing up this section with those 4 people? And once, okay, so no objection. So Jorg, Jad, Natasha, and Serena, please quickly ask your questions in that order.
Hi, my name is Jörg. I would like to ask how you work together with the Land Back movement and how we could participate there.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for coming. On Standing Rock, I was watching it and a couple friends went, and when they returned, they reported back to me. And while I think it was a really awesome, shocking, in a great way effort, I think like watching it, you got the impression that it was bound to fail. And I feel as though like similar actions like that in the future are going to require a greater degree of solidarity and crosswork with organized labor. And I was wondering if you could share some of your thoughts on that and what sort of experiences you had.
Okay, Serena? Oh, go ahead.
Hold on, I just forgot to unmute. Okay, I've been following Winona LaDuke's work since the late 90s, saw her speak 4 times. And one of the things she did when she spoke was to encourage us to buy wild rice from the White Earth Res through the Native Harvest group. And I've done that before, and I think it's a good thing to do it again. Also, Native Harvest is doing hemp manufacturing for all kinds of goods, and that's another thing she's been promoting. Thank you.
Serena?
Hi there. I just was hoping that you could speak to how care work should be integral to Red New Deal and Green New Deal. Thanks.
That was it. That was the end of stack.
Oh, okay. I don't, I'll try to just, I don't know, I'll just pick one of those, I guess. Like, I'm just like one person and I don't have answers for all of this stuff. And like, it's going to require a lot of movement work, and it's not unprecedented to ally with unions who are actually engaged in the extractive industries. It's been done in the past, but it actually requires people in those unions to really take a lot of risks. And it's also to assume that the labor movement is always progressive, which it isn't, especially when it comes to Indigenous rights. And it's something that we have to work on. And this is a long-term struggle. These problems aren't going to be solved overnight. And I wouldn't say that the Standing Rock movement was doomed to fail. I don't believe in eschatology or teleology or destiny or whatever like that kind of assumption is, because it won in many ways that are incredibly important. That even us writing the Red New Deal or the Green New Deal or being proponents of it, we haven't had the same kind of impact as like the Indigenous movement as a whole for challenging a quarter of carbon emissions. What movement can you say in this country? It's no offense to 350 or to Sunrise or whatever, but they simply haven't had the same impact as Indigenous-led movements in terms of their militancy and their ability to actually stop and challenge pipelines. Because it's not just about frontline tactics. I think we're kind of reducing the movement itself to just one kind of tactic. It involves a variety of things that oftentimes mainstream society just doesn't see. it requires a deep understanding of tribal sovereignty and the legal processes that go underway, as well as the kind of community building efforts that reconnect with the land, which are part of the land back movement, and the care work that kind of goes into those kinds of local economies, whether it's wild rice or whatever, that we have to support. And it's, again, like I don't have, like, I'm not like a sage or anything. I'm not giving you like answers. We all have to struggle together in this and like work through those contradictions.
Thank you. Nick, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for being with us for this meeting. Awesome. Okay, so next we have a labor working group update with our Starbucks comrade.